on this episode of the Paranormal Rundown.
So, if we're going to do a roundup, what should we round up?
Well, the one that we've already put off from a previous rundown is Theodicy.
That is the one that always keeps coming up.
So,
and I had the perfect story, I think, at least to help frame the conversation.
Let's do that.
Then let's do it.
So back in college, there was a 400 level seminar for religion that you had to take at some point. And I took it pretty early on. I think my sophomore year I took it. And we had to write a huge term paper, and I chose Theodicy. And I started off that paper with an anecdote, a mythical anecdote that has stuck with me to this day. And I've actually quoted it on Southern Demonology once before, but it was a very long time ago. And they go something like this. There are two explorers off into the desert. And one day they come upon a garden. An immaculately maintained garden. And they are amazed. Like, they're wandering through the rows and rows of vegetables and flowers and fruits. And one of the explorers looks to the other and says, there has to be a gardener who is maintaining such perfect order in the middle of the desert. And the other one goes, well, I mean, that would make sense, but I sure don't see anybody. So the first gardener goes, okay, we just need to hide. And I bet they're out moving around at night under the cover of darkness. And they go, okay, let's do that. So they do, and they hide out for a week. Nothing. No sign of any gardener whatsoever. And so the first one goes, okay, that did not work. But I bet they are invisible. And that's why we've detected no presence of them. And so they round up, don't ask from where, a group of dogs. They get night vision goggles. They put up radar everywhere they can with lasers and tripwires. And they patrol this garden for a month. Nothing. And the second guy goes, look, I told you there is no gardener. And the first one goes, okay, how about this? There has to be a gardener. There's proof of it everywhere before us. But I would probably say that the gardener is invisible, undetectable, and unknowable. And the second explorer says, okay, that might be, but what's the difference between that and no gardener at all? Discuss.
The garden.
Yeah, it's a metaphor, of course. The gardener is the world.
Garden is the world, and the possible gardener is God and his works in the world.
Correct.
I think it with the whole story in the back line in the garden and the gardener. I think that's just an astounding portrayal of faith. And the reason why I say faith is because, there's things out there that can't be explained. And some things just have to be just accepted by faith. That's like the ye old question, who created God? Well, we just know he just exists. And that is something that you have to accept ultimately by faith. Or
Father Birdsong, do you know who you sound like right now?
Who's that?
I mean this in a a positive way. And by the way,
Yeah.
I am not an atheist. I'm not advocating for atheism. I'm not trying to say that
Right.
whatsoever. But no, you sound like, have you ever heard of Immanuel Kant?
Yes.
No.
All right. Kant was a philosopher who was he occupied both extremes. So he came at the very tail end of the Enlightenment period into the Romance period. However, he was the most kind of staunch advocate for logic and dryness that there ever was. However, he actually, one of his first major works was a book called On the Aesthetics of the Beautiful and the Sublime, which actually earned him a professorship of poetry, of all things, at the University of Berlin, I think it is, and which he turned down. But he was a man who would take his walks at 5 p.m. every single day without fail. And in fact, one time that he got sick and could not make his walks, the village clock was off because they would set their clocks, the town clock, by his walks. He was that steady. But Kant was famous for coming up with the categorical imperative. But at the end of the day, what he was thinking was that what we know of is based upon categories. So a man walking along a beach is a man, the idea of walking, what a beach is, etc. And he said there is a category for all things except for God.
Okay.
Well,
That kind of makes sense.
Also, look, I can't out philosophize JJ, but I mean,
Neither can I.
There's the the Kantian leap of faith,
Right.
you know, where at some point one has to simply say, I will accept this.
Right. In fact, Kant said, and I kind of left off the most important part, sorry about that, is there's no category for God, which leaves all the more room for faith.
Correct.
Exactly.
All right,
Exactly
so
right.
help me out here, because you guys have talked about Theodicy multiple times as something we need to discuss. And honestly, I haven't really thought about the term or heard the term in a long time. Maybe it was mentioned in philosophy, I don't remember. But so I looked up the definition. And the definition of theodicy on Webster says it's the defense of God's goodness and omnipotence in view of the existence of evil.
In a world that's full of evil and pain and injustice and horror.
So what I've heard is so far is, hey, here's goodness. You know, does that have to be God? Is there a God that exists that made that? I've heard from you guys so far like how do we justify that there is a God, sort of, right? But where does the evil come into this? Evil as the kicker, right? It's the having evil. Does that justify the case for God, or does it make it more difficult to justify the case for God? Is that what Theodicy is really all about?
Well,
I think
it is the justification for God, and it can be taken in two different paths. The first is if there really is a God, but what it's taken for more times in theology and philosophy is the justification of God, of can you actually show that there is a being of pure goodness in the face of evil? And like, for example, most introductory philosophy students, their professors will assign to them in Philosophy 101 to read the one chapter from Bratia Karamazov, the Brothers Karamazov, on the executioner, because that sums up so perfectly the idea of evil.
And I think it also comes down to back to the faith part, but also to a person's choice. And whenever I hear of just basically about the story that you just told, it reminds me of when you're talking about the garden and the gardener, it reminds me of the Song of Solomon, to where it says, I've come into my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have prepared the sacrifice. I have prepared the banquet table, so on and so forth. But what it really boils down to is someone, just like Big said earlier, taking that leap of faith or making the choice to go down one of these paths. Ultimately, everybody's going to have to choose a path. And I think that's, in my view, I think that's what it's all about, is making a choice, one way or the other. You can't have it both ways. Everybody's going to have to take a path at some point.
Hear all the exciting details on the Paranormal Rundown, available on all podcast platforms, YouTube and Rumble.